great, great pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Andrew Fisher. Andrew, first we met when he came as a pastoral placement to our charity and to work with Neil. And we thought it would be a good idea if we sort of wakened him up a bit and brought him to a fellowship conference. He was promptly sick. So now I don't think we need to say anything more. He's here and very much part of the fellowship. So over to Andrew.
Well, thanks very much, Barbara. Thank you, everybody. I'm just thinking we've all got full tummies now. It's getting on late at night. The lights have been subdued. Should we just nod off for a bit? I'd like to share with you, if I may, a story. One day there was a minister and he was booking his holiday on the internet and he was looking for some suitable hotel accommodation. And after finding something suitable, the minister, he started to pack his belongings, but then he remembered that he hadn't noticed whether the room had a bathroom or not, or as he called it, a water closet. So he emailed the hotel and asked whether there was indeed a WC or not. The hotelier who received the email wasn't familiar with the expression WC, but with the message coming from a minister, he decided that the inquiry must have been about a Wesleyan chapel. Later that day, the minister received the following email from the hotel. Dear Reverend, thank you for your inquiry. The nearest WC is located 9 miles from the hotel, in the heart of a beautiful copse of trees. It will seat 150 people at a time, and it's open on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Some people bring their lunch with them and make a day of it. On Thursdays, there is an organ accompaniment. The acoustics are very good, and the slightest sound can be heard by everyone. It may interest you to know that my daughter met her husband at the WC. Donations are being taken to purchase cushioned seats. There is a long-felt need for this, as the present seats have holes in them. My wife, being rather delicate, hasn't been able to attend regularly. It has been 6 months since she last went. Naturally, it pains her not to be able to go more often. I will close now with the desire to accommodate you in every way possible, and I would be happy to request for you a seat either in front or near the door, as you prefer. I await your response. Friends, church buildings, regardless of whether they are Wesleyan chapels or not, are held to be places of wonder, places where visitors can find both mystery and answers, places where we can feel both properly humble and immensely dignified, and above all, church buildings should be places where we feel drawn closer to God. Ever since I was a child, I've been fascinated by church buildings. I can remember when, as a toddler, I used to be wheeled past the local parish church in my pushchair. The church was St. Martin's, Alfreton, in Derbyshire. And from the pushchair, my attention was immediately caught by the lovely black and white clock on the church tower, with its gilded numbers and hands. And my mum and dad always had to stop for me to look and point at it. Such was the clock's impression on me that the word clock was one of my first words, much to mum and dad's disappointment. That fascination of church architecture, church buildings, has never left me. As a boy, I devoured books on what to look for inside and outside of a church. And as a snotty teenager, I bored the pants of vicars and their church wardens as they unlocked their sadly often locked churches and let me look around. As the title of my talk suggests, I want to talk about church buildings and how over the centuries religious imagery and imagination has helped to shape them. And just as importantly, I would also like something to say about why I think church buildings are special. And I would like us to think about what our church buildings are for. Long ago in the book of Genesis, we're told the story of Jacob, who had a lucid dream of angels going up and down from heaven. In response to his dream, Jacob exclaims, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And echoing Jacob's words centuries later, Christians have called church buildings Domus Dei, the house of God, and Porta Coeli, the gate of heaven, dwellings where we can go and find God. And for that reason, Christians understand church buildings to be sacred places, places set apart. Indeed, the canon law of the modern-day Roman Catholic Church defines a church building as a sacred building designed for divine worship. Like me when I was a snotty teenager, many people today have questions about the distinctive parts of a church building and the many fixtures and fittings therein. As a vicar, I'm often asked questions like, why is there a rail before the altar? Why do you have carvings and statues here? Why are there cushions to kneel on? Why is there a tower and bells? Andrew, what does all this mean? Well, actually, it all means a great deal. Nearly every detail of a church building has a precise and rich meaning, pointing to important aspects of Christian faith and worship. So questions from toddlers and teenagers alike are very relevant, I think, and they give us a wonderful opportunity to talk about God and about our faith. So what is it that makes a church building a specifically sacred place, a Domus Dei, a Porta Coeli, destined for divine worship? In her catechism, the Roman Catholic Church says this about church buildings. Visible churches are not simply gathering places, but signify and make visible the church living in this place, the dwelling of God with humanity, reconciled and united in Christ. In this house of God, the truth and the harmony of the signs that make it up should show Christ to be present and active in this place. The primary point then of a church building, of this house of God, is that it should exist to show Jesus Christ and his church present and active in both town and country. And clergy, congregations, stonemasons and architects have been striving to do just that for centuries, using a specific architectural language. And this architectural language transforms mere bricks and mortar, mere wood and nails, mere stone and concrete into a church building, the sacred place worthy of containing a sense of God's eternal presence and the medium through which we are helped to settle into that presence. It sounds like a simple idea that a church building should look and feel like a church. And there are many ways that church buildings accomplish that. But regardless of any architectural style or denominational bias, I'd like to suggest, please, that there are three primary principles which define the concept of a church building. These principles, I suggest, are verticality, permanence, and iconography. The principle of verticality is apparent as soon as we think of a church building. We immediately picture a vertical tower or spire riding over the countryside or a townscape. And some of the tallest structures ever built have been church towers and steeples, and I perhaps ought to say that a steeple is a tower and spire combined. Lincolnshire is a county rich in tall towers and spires. The somewhat ironically named Boston Stump is 272 foot high. And before it collapsed in 1549, the central spire of Lincoln Cathedral soared to the height of 529 foot high, higher than the Great Pyramid at Giza. In its heyday, Lincoln Cathedral was the tallest religious structure ever built. And only the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona will top that record if it's ever completed, with its central Jesus steeple measuring 560 feet. Unlike most secular buildings, church buildings are designed so that the vertical dominates the horizontal. The spire at Salisbury Cathedral has been likened to a finger pointing towards heaven. And Sir Christopher Wren, centuries later, purposely designed the dome of St. Paul's to float over the rooftops of London. The 19th century writer and architect Augustus Pugin advocated the use of high-pitched roofs on churches, continuing to emphasize that vertical over the horizontal. That vertical accent also dominates the horizontal inside church buildings. The often high vaults and ceilings continue to speak to us of our reaching towards heaven, of transcendence, bringing the heavenly Jerusalem down to us through walls, columns, and arches. In other words, the interior spaces of churches tend to have verticality, a dramatic sense of height. And so, friends, if verticality is our first principle of church building, we next consider permanence. Most church buildings are designed from the outset as being permanent structures built, as the hymn goes, on a firm foundation. Conversely, most secular buildings tend to be temporary structures. Today, architects design and build shops and offices with the expectation that they will be demolished a decade or so later to make way for a newer and more fashionable building. Yet in so many places, the old parish church remains. Some, like Brixworth Church in Northamptonshire, dating from Anglo-Saxon times. Throughout the centuries, stonemasons and architects have asserted a sense of permanence into their church buildings. Churches are most often made from durable material, be it stone, brick, or concrete. Very few churches are made out of wood. And churches are built as a significant architectural mass, built with solid foundations and walls, allowing for generous interior spaces. The 19th century church architect Ralph Adams Cram put it well when he wrote this: "Instead of the cheap and tawdry structures of shingles and clapboards, of flimsy brick and stone veneering, doomed to decay, we should have once more solid and enduring temples, that even if by reason of our artistic backwardness could not at first compare with the noble work of the Middle Ages." And in the 1960s, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, architect of the Anglican Cathedral at Liverpool, wrote this: "The artistic tastes of priests is appalling. And I am most anxious to have a church in which everything is genuine and good and not tawdry and ostentatious." A stern warning to myself and any fellow clergy out there. The final principle which I suggest defines a church building is its iconography. Church buildings always display some kind of religious imagery, some kind of religious carving or artwork. There will be a cross on a gable or screwed to the wall, a saint or angel positioned in a niche. A church building teaches through its imagery. It inspires, it catechizes, it evangelizes. The building shows Jesus Christ and his church present and active in its specific parish or locale. If a church building can be mistaken for a library, a nursing home, a shopping centre, town hall, hospital or cinema, then it's failed in that regard. A town hall tells us little about our faith. A cinema seldom evangelises through its architecture, and a shopping centre does little to reinforce the presence of Christ active in the world. I suggest that a church building must look like a church building before the building has any chance of being a sign to its parish or its community. And that means both inside and out. It must first look like a church before it can be, in essence, a church. In the 19th century, two Anglican priests, John Mason Neale and Benjamin Webb, published a very influential book entitled The Symbolism of Churches and Church Ornaments, also known by the name of the medieval bishop who inspired it, Durandus of Mende. And in the introduction to their book, the authors argued that absolutely every architectural element of a medieval church building was religiously symbolic. They write, "Is it possible to conceive that the church which invented so deeply symbolical a system of worship should have rested content with an unsymbolical building for its practice?" And their argument complete, Neale and Webb go on to give us their examples of religious symbolism. If you come from a parish church, especially if it's medieval or Victorian, see if you recognise any of these in your church building. Symbols of the Holy Trinity include the triple division of a church into nave, choir, and sanctuary, the threefold altar steps, the triple division of windows placed at the altar end of the church. The doctrine of the atonement is represented by a cross-shaped plan and gable crosses. The communion of saints is symbolised by monuments and the presence of a Lady Chapel. Stained glass windows symbolise Jesus, the light of the world. Foiled circles typifying the crown of Christ. They represent the King of Kings. A window of two lights represents the two natures of Christ, or the mission of the disciples, 2 by 2. Pointed arches remind us of our hands in prayer. And their list goes on. At the close of the book, the authors advise that church architects must take a religious view of their profession. And they say, "We do protest against the merely business-like spirit of the modern profession and demand from them a more elevated and directly religious habit of mind." A stern warning then to any architects out there. Well, friends, now that I've suggested principles of design that I think make church buildings look and feel like church buildings, I would like to begin in looking at more detail at church buildings themselves, beginning with the site. Many churches, such as the Victorian St Bartholomew's in Brighton, were designed to dominate the urban landscape. In times past, there was no doubt that the church building was the most important structure in the parish. In other places where church buildings were more modest in size, they were often built on a hill or a high point to indicate Christ's dominance. Medieval stonemasons interpreted church buildings as being the city on a hill, referred to in Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, and also the New Jerusalem, spoken of in Revelation 21, verse 2. And stonemasons and clergy took those texts as referring to the location of churches on high places, with the sense of them being fortified, protected sanctuaries. A very literal example of such a location is Mont Saint-Michel in France. In England during the 18th century, the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor designed his churches in a very similar way, although he clothed them in a more Baroque dress. Today, when new churches are built, the siting is still important. Church buildings shouldn't be hidden, because hidden signs are bad signs. And architects often try and integrate churches into the landscape in such a way that its site reminds us of the building's importance and purpose. The physical connection between the church and the parish is an important one as well, and it's often accomplished, at least traditionally, through the piazza or the courtyard. A recent example of this is the piazza and steps created in front of the Metropolitan Cathedral at Liverpool in 2003. And here we have a place for people to congregate. It is the preparation for our dramatic entrance into the gateway to heaven. And it is a place that often serves as a backdrop for religious and civic functions. Often in the past, steps, fountains, or colonnades have been used in the designs of such piazzas. But you might have noticed that in many places today, it's the car park that can dominate. And that serves as a kind of anti-piazza. Rather than preparing us for entry into a church, it more often than not makes us angry. As we approach the church building, even before we can see the entire building or even the front entrance, we ought to be able to see a bell turret or a bell tower. The bell tower is one of the vertical elements that draws us to a church visually and also by the sound of its bells, which serves both as a timepiece and a call to prayer. The use of church bells dates back at least to the 8th century, when such bells were mentioned in the writings of Pope Stephen III. And not only did they serve to call people to the church for Mass, which they still do or ought to do, but bells were also rung to wake up the monks for them to say their night prayers. There'll be one going off in about an hour or so. By the Middle Ages, every church building was provided with one or more bells, and the bell tower became an important feature of the church building. In the 17th century, Sir Christopher Wren recognised the importance of bell towers, and the church authorities made it a policy that his new parish churches in London, like St Mary Le Bow, should be built with a bell tower. Another visual element in church buildings is the steeple or dome, surmounted either by a cross or a weathercock reminding us of St. Peter's denial of Christ and his restitution. Popularised during the Renaissance, the dome, which can be round or sometimes oval, has significant effects on both the church's interior and exterior. In the interior, it adds to that sense of verticality and transcendence by the way that a dome allows shafts of light to penetrate the interior of a church. As we approach our church building, the facade, that is the front exterior, becomes important. And the facade can often be the most memorable part of a church. It sometimes incorporates the bell tower, statues or sculpture, windows, and of course the main entrance doors. And in an urban setting in which the church may be dwarfed by surrounding structures, the facade takes on an extra importance in that the church itself becomes identified with the facade. The facade and the front entrance marks a further step of transition for us from the secular, the exterior world, to the sacred, the interior space of the church. And the facade has the most opportunity to evangelize, to inspire, teach, and catechize through its exterior imagery and artwork. From the 11th century onwards, the decoration of church entrances became an important feature of church design. And the amazing facade of Wells Cathedral was designed as a porticele in stone, a tangible portrayal of the entranceway to heaven, with rows and rows of statues of saints and angels. And behind those statues of saints and angels, there actually runs a series of narrow galleries from which cantors and choir boys used to sing and blow trumpets. To the people outside in the piazza, in the courtyard, it was like the very saints and angels on that cathedral were singing to them, drawing their hearts and souls towards God and their bodies into the church building. Coming into the church, worshippers enter the narthex. And the narthex serves as a vestibule, a place to shake the snow from our shoes, or remove a hat, or drop an umbrella. It's also the place where processions can assemble, and for this reason the narthex is often known as the Galilee, since the procession from the narthex towards the altar inside the church symbolizes Christ's journey from Galilee to Jerusalem for his crucifixion. As we contemplate the interior of our church building, we might picture the image of the crucified Christ, with arms outstretched, superimposed over the floor plan of a typical basilica-style church. And this is intentional and informative for us. The head of Christ fits into the sanctuary. The arms become the transepts, and the body and legs fill out the nave. So here we can see the church building, the stone and mortar, becoming literally the body of Christ. And it's no coincidence that the floor plan is in the shape of a cross, and it's called a cruciform plan, which reminds us of Christ on the cross. Now that term that I used, basilica, literally means house of the king. And of course it's a fitting title for the house of God, since Christians understand Jesus to be the Christ, the King of Kings. And the basilican form is the plan upon which most of the past 1700 years of church design has been based. A basilican church is usually laid out as a rectangle twice as long as its width, with 2 rows of columns running the length of the body, separating the aisles from the nave. In the past 50 years or so, however, that basilican plan has been passed over in favour of newer forms based rather on the Greek amphitheatre and the Roman circus, placing the altar in the midst of the people rather than at one end of the building. And perhaps the most famous example of that is the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool, the cathedral in the round. Friends, once we enter through those narthex doors, we enter the main body of the church, the nave, which is the Latin word for ship. The nave is the place where the congregation sits, and it's so called because figuratively the nave represents the ark of salvation. An apostolic constitution of the 4th century declared, "Let the building be long, with its head to the east, and so it will be like a ship." And in the nave we can find holy water fonts, or stoups as they are sometimes known. And here as we enter we can bless ourselves with holy water, reminding ourselves of our baptisms and also our sins. St. Charles Borromeo, who was instrumental in the design of Counter-Reformation churches in the 16th century, laid down the following rules for the shape, size and material of the holy water stoup. He said, "The stoup should be made of marble or solid stone, neither porous nor with cracks. It should rest upon a handsomely wrought column and should not be placed outside a church but within it, and in so far as possible to the right of those who enter." Immediately related to the nave is the baptistry, the place in the church that is designed especially for the rite of baptism. The earliest baptistries were freestanding buildings separate from the church itself, but later baptistries were built as rooms located directly off the nave. Baptistries were typically octagonal, as were the baptismal fonts therein, alluding to Christ's resurrection on the 8th day. Sunday comes after Saturday, the Sabbath or 7th day of the week. 8 thus represents the opening of a new dawn for the Christian soul. The religious imagery most commonly associated with the font and the baptistry is the baptism of Christ by John the Baptist. The dove representing the Holy Spirit is another popular image, since baptism is the sending of the Holy Spirit to rest on the soul of the baptized. After the nave and baptistry, we come in our church building to the choir. Now, the choir is the place in the church set aside for those members of the congregation who are specially trained to lead the sung parts of the worship. In many ancient churches, the choir was made up of a series of stalls at the front part of the nave near the altar, but this was common only when the singers were exclusively clergy. The first church known to accommodate singers was St. Clement in Rome, when an enclosed choir called the Schola Cantorum was placed in the nave during the 12th century. Nowadays, more modern churches place the singers in a western gallery where they can lead the singing from behind the congregation. After the choir, we come finally to the church's sanctuary. Now, for good or bad, when we talk about the sanctuary, it's helpful to remember that the church as an institution is hierarchical. It's composed of different members, the head being Christ, with the bishops and priests, each serving as did the apostles, and the laity serving their own functions as part of the church militant. And that hierarchy is reflected in traditional worship. In an address to bishops in 1998, Pope John Paul II said this about worship: "Worship, like the church, is intended to be hierarchical and polyphonic, respecting the different roles assigned by Christ and allowing all the different voices to blend into one great hymn of praise." It follows then that if the church and her worship are both hierarchical, the church building will naturally reflect that hierarchy. And it's most obvious when we consider what makes the sanctuary distinct from the nave. The general instruction of the Roman Missal states that the sanctuary should be marked off from the nave by a higher floor level and by a distinctive structure or decor. So we see that the sanctuary is meant to be a separate place, all of its own, in our church building. The plan of a basilican-style church is designed to reflect that of the temple in Jerusalem. The nave represents the people's area, the court of the Gentiles, the choir, the court of the Jews, and the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. Sanctuary floors are traditionally raised above the level of the nave for two reasons. Firstly, if the sanctuary is supposed to symbolize the head of Christ, it's only natural that the head be higher than the body. Secondly, and more practically, the sanctuary is raised so that the congregation can have a better view of the altar and the ceremony is acted out there. The Roman Missal calls for the sanctuary to be marked off by a distinctive structure. And one such structure is the altar rail. The altar rail not only serves to define the sanctuary, it's functional as well. The altar rail was the invention of the Anglican Archbishop William Laud in the 17th century, who wanted to keep stray dogs from profaning the altar. Literally. These days, however, the congregation obviously can use it from which to receive Holy Communion, kneeling in adoration and humility. The most important and dignified piece of furniture in the sanctuary and of the entire church building is, of course, the altar, the place where the Eucharist is offered and Holy Communion celebrated. And in fact, as the 20th century architect Sir Ninian Comper recognised, a church building is built for the altar, not the altar for the church building. And it is for that reason that all the sight lines in church buildings naturally converge upon the altar, just as the Eucharist reaches its climax in the prayer of consecration. When Christians gained freedom of public worship in the 4th century, permanent altars, usually made of stone, were erected for the first time in Europe. So great was the veneration of the martyrs who died for Christ that almost every church built in those years was sited over the tomb of a martyr, and the church went on to take on the name of the martyred saint. Because of that tradition, relics of the saints were placed within the altar, and until recently, altars in the Roman Catholic Church were required to hold the authenticated relics of at least 2 canonized saints. Sometimes a wooden, stone or metal canopy is built over the altar, such as the ones designed by Henry Wilson at St Bartholomew's in Brighton, Stephen Dykes Bowers at St Paul's Cathedral in London, and Sebastian Comper's at Derby Cathedral. And that canopy is called a baldacchino or a ciborium. Another essential element of a church building is the pulpit, which can be placed either in or near the sanctuary or closer to the congregation in the nave. Now, for one reason or another, the raised pulpit seems to be disappearing from our churches, and it's often placed with what's called an ambo, which resembles the more secular lectern, and it's neither raised nor ornate. Pulpit literally means a raised platform, and pulpits have been used in churches since the 13th century, when the Franciscans and Dominicans especially placed great emphasis on preaching. Pulpits have often been crafted as a work of art, not only functional, but beautiful as well, commonly decorated with carvings of saints or scenes from the scriptures. On the pulpit, or behind the pulpit, we can often find a crucifix, a representation of the cross, including an image of Jesus suffering on the cross. That visible image of suffering helps us to better connect with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and it reminds us of the words of St. Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 18. St. Paul says, For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. According to Pope Pius XII in his 1947 encyclical Mediator Dei, he says, "One would be straying from the straight path were he to order a crucifix so designed that the divine Redeemer's body showed no sign of his cruel sufferings." And on a more humorous note, I'm reminded of a person who went into a cathedral shop once and said, "Oh, I'd love to buy a crucifix, please." And the shop assistant said, "Of course, which one would you like?" And the person said, "Oh, I'd like that one with a little body on it, please." Devotional artifacts, or ought to affect, all parts of a church building, inside and out. Sacred art takes many forms. It can be in the form of statues or reliefs, paintings or murals, mosaics, icons and stained glass. They're the most common forms. And successful church art enhances the church building and it enhances our worship. It draws our hearts and minds to God through its beauty and through its meaning. I think that sacred art, unlike modern art, it's not all about itself. It's about the other. It's about the divine. And sacred art tells the stories of the scriptures of Christ, the saints, and the church herself. The architect Ralph Adams Cram once wrote that art has been, is, and will be forever the greatest agency for spiritual impression that the church may claim. And it is for that reason, Cram concludes, that art in its highest manifestation is the expression of religious truth. Friends, as I begin to draw to a close now, and as we hold on to those words of Cram, I'd like us to go back to the beginning of my talk, when I said a little bit about my childhood and my love of church buildings. Now, as a teenager, my snottiness might have diminished, but my fascination in church architecture grew and grew. I became not a little obsessive, as we might say that Pugin did, or Neil and Webb. And once I learned how to drive and bought my first car, don't tell Mum, don't tell Dad, but instead of going to college lectures, I could often be found driving around the countryside, visiting grand Victorian and Edwardian churches for their architecture. And friends, out of all those churches, there were two that made a profound impression on me. The first was Pugin's gem, St Giles Church at Cheadle, just outside of Stoke-on-Trent, with its 200-foot spire pointing to the heavens like a holy missile. The other was Holy Angels at Hoare Cross, also in Staffordshire, designed by George Frederick Bodley. Sitting on a hill next to Hoare Cross Hall, Holy Angels is a vision of Gothic splendour in stone. Both were and are outstanding buildings, but there was something else about those places. Standing inside those buildings, to me the prayers of the faithful were almost tangible. To me, the presence of God could be felt, and that made a profound impression on me. Those two churches helped bring me to faith, not because of their architecture, as stunning as that is, but rather because of what those churches were for and are for, because of God. Friends, I think there needs, in the end, to be something more than having a world-class architect design a church. I think that there needs to be something more than whether our churches are Greek or Gothic or modern in style, or whether they're made of brick, stone or concrete. Above all, our church buildings need to be prayed in. They need to be worshipped in. They need to bring us into the presence of God and to bring us soonest to our knees. This is what we have in our parishes, and this is what our church buildings have witnessed to for thousands of years. As the good book says, and I don't necessarily mean Durandus, I mean the Bible, this is the house of God. This is the gate of heaven.
I'd like to thank Andrew very much for his insights, some that we knew but had forgotten. And I think there might be some questions.
Thank you, Ian Fordyce. I worship in a wonderfully beautiful church dedicated to St. Peter in Burnham, and we have lots of weddings there because everybody picks it out as a beautiful church to be married in, or indeed christenings. But my vicar and I feel that it is inhabited by spirits, benign spirits of the faithful, long departed, and sometimes my vicar says he feels them brush past him in the night when he's walking through the church and it's not illuminated. Is there any tradition about that, or is that just him and I being a bit strange?
There is indeed a tradition of that, and of course many old churches are surrounded by the graves of the faithful. And of course in life, church buildings were the hub of communities, the place where people found sanctuary, the place where people met one another and talked and shared fellowship as well as faith. So I think it's only natural that every now and again we might feel the closeness of one of those folk with us, and it's wonderful that you can feel the closeness of past members of the congregation there. We talk about the communion of saints, and I think when things like that happen, it makes that part of the creed a little bit more understandable and warmer. Thank you, Ian. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. This is not a question, it's a comment. I'm sure you've experienced, I have as a parish priest, having fortunately had some very beautiful churches. I once had, my first incumbency was in a modern 1950s brick-built building in Crawley, in Sussex, a new town, by an architect very gifted in the field of bus garages. It's interesting that people said of the building, "Oh, it's a church, is it?" But the more serious point I want to make is that how many people one finds with the church, if one's able to open it, which certainly where I am in Frome now they are, people who come in to sit there and people who speak of going it to stay there. I find it much easier to be close to God, they say, when I come into the church when it's empty, rather than when it's full of those noisy Christians on a Sunday morning, which says much for us. But thank you for your talk. I have to say, to my shame, my wife has. I've never been to St Giles Cheadle or to Holy Cross. I know of them and I've looked at the pictures. I feel called, I must make a pilgrimage to Staffordshire. But the picture of Wells Cathedral, which is my cathedral, some of you may have seen some years ago, the rather unlikely but very good, effective presenter of Janet Street Porter, who also loves ancient buildings and walking, and she combines the two. And with some clever bits of technology, she exhibited something that we've forgotten. With some clever computer work, she coloured the facade. If you want to see brightly coloured facades, you need to go to India and look at modern Hindu temples. Brightly coloured, sometimes it seems to Europeans rather kitschy. That's because we forget that certainly the stone statues at Wells were originally coloured. And gradually the colour faded away. And she did this thing, and suddenly it was there, and I could have been in South India, but we were in Wells. And I think there's this curious thing, particularly with the Church of England, of blending together, which I think it managed to succeed, of both the richness of the Catholic tradition and the rigours of the Puritan Protestant tradition, because there are one or two stark Protestant places of worship where the emptiness is also the imagery. But thank you very much, because it's a super canter through something I love as well.
Thank you for that, Kevin. I'm just thinking of two churches where the colour is on the inside. One is by George Bodley, just outside of Liverpool city centre at Tobruk. And from top to bottom on the inside, it's stencilled in glorious colour. Although Bodley had a great sense of refinement and a good eye for colour, so it's not jarring and overpowering when you go in, but you do get a sense of how a medieval church must have looked in the height of the medieval period. Pugin's gem at Cheadle is coloured on the inside and was from the outset, but Pugin slapped it on rather more thickly than what Bodley would have done. And so Cheadle is quite overpowering and quite dark on the inside because of that. But certainly, yeah, I mean, colour was a big part of Gothic architecture in the Middle Ages. And even the more Protestant strand in the Church of England had its own reason for having not so much colour. In a typical Christopher Wren London church, where there's the very dark woodwork and then the whitewashed walls, as plain as it looks, that had its own symbolism as well, that the dark woodwork represented the world and its often dark places. And the lightness was the sanity and reason and order of God. So even in a plain, more Protestant church, the plain colours still had their own symbolism.
I just wanted to comment about this business of colour. I think one of the interesting things is that the Victorians didn't get colour right in many places. In other words, I'm thinking about their stained glass. They put too many colours into a small space, and the result was chaos, whereas the medieval instinct for colour was spot on. When I was a child, I used to collect British Empire stamps, and when they were under the king or the queen, whatever, they used to be modest and restrained, and then they became independent. They went sort of jazzy.
Yes, yes.
But what I'm trying to say is, I don't know whether, I mean, I've never read this anywhere, but it's purely from internal aesthetics. Colours, many of the Victorians got it wrong because they just tried to put too much colour.
Yeah, it was the Victorian time was a whole process of experimentation. Stained glass originated at a cathedral church just outside of Paris, Saint-Denis, under Abbot Suger. In Suger's theology, stained glass was there because it held images of saints, and the light coming in through those images of saints made the light somehow holy. The colours were absolutely right. Now, the Victorians, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, you know, the glass was really garish to start with. But later and later in the Victorian period, going into Edwardian times, like when churches like Hall Cross were being built, they did realise that something needed to be done about the brightness of the colours. Sorry to quote Bodley again and to exemplify his work. Bodley always used a firm of glaziers called Burleson and Grills, and they would design the most beautiful stained glass windows. And once they were in place, Bodley used to walk around the church building and order the workmen to paint them with brown umber glaze on the inside to tone them down. So Bodley understood that actually, you know, the workmen weren't getting the colours quite right in the glass factories, and he tried to tone them down because of that.
There is in the Welsh Museum, sort of open-air museum at St Fagans, a redundant church rebuilt there and furnished as it would have been in 1530. It's no longer really a functional church, but it gives you a very good idea of what a medieval church was like. And people going into it very often say, but surely churches in this country were never like that. It's too ornate. outside it's very plain white building. Inside, every inch is coloured, and but the symbolism is right. It's a splendid sense of the numinous. But if ever you get the chance of seeing it, it's an interesting example of what churches used to be like before the Reformation. One other comment, again referring to Wells Cathedral, which has, with the inverted arches, where one visitor looked at them and said, a design defect turned into a thing of beauty.
Yes.
But on the inverted arches facing towards the nave, a previous dean had the rood erected, the cross of Christ, with Christ on the cross either side, Mary and the beloved disciple. And on one occasion, a small boy visiting the cathedral, who are those up there? Clearly it meant nothing to him. It was explained this was Jesus on the cross with Mary, his mother, and the beloved disciple. He said, but that's quite right, isn't it? When you were dying, you'd want your mother and your best friend, wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah. Oh. Thanks.
George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, didn't approve of steeples, as he called them. I think he believed that there was that of God in each person, and that therefore we can worship anywhere. I personally love some of the great cathedrals, especially Ely, but I do feel that we can feel the presence of God in a Quaker meeting house, in the silence and the beauty of that.
Yes.
I think it's about time we call an end to this. And just to have a little thing at the end is that churches and cathedrals, if you think about it, are things that really feed our senses. And different people will get something from a different aspect in that church, and they will become more aware, and it'll help the more awareness of God in the same process. Yeah.
Like a different thing.
Like a different thing. Yeah. So a final thank you to Andrew. He's a great person, even if he's sick when he comes to the conference.